Darwin and Evolution, presented by the Purdue Global Science Center. The concept of descent with modification, otherwise known as evolution, has been hotly debated for well over 100 years. Few arguments have polarized the country quite like this one, and attacks from either side have become personal. It is difficult to believe that this century-long controversy all started with one modest and soft-spoken man named Charles Robert Darwin. Darwin was born in 1809, the grandson of a famous poet named Erasmus Darwin. Despite his grandson's claim to fame, Erasmus actually speculated about species change in some of his works long before Darwin was born. Darwin was born to a wealthy family in the town of Shrewsbury, England. Living a privileged life, he was an educated man. His initial career plans included medicine, at least up until he realized he could not stand the sight of blood or human suffering. After one particularly grueling day in surgery, Darwin rushed out of the operating room, never to return. His father proposed the alternative, yet respectable career of a country parson with his own church. In 1827, Darwin was admitted to Christ's College in Cambridge to begin his journey as a clergyman. As he began to study, he also became a passionate amateur naturalist. While at Christ's College, Darwin began a beetle collection and started to publish some of his first scientific papers. His very first published word was Cambridge. Darwin graduated from Christ's College in 1831, but by then his passion for naturalism was beginning to flourish. One day he was out collecting beetles and found 3 rare specimens that he wanted for his collection. Rather than risk killing one or losing another, he held 2 of the beetles in each hand and the third in his mouth. Soon after graduation, Darwin was offered a position to travel as a naturalist on a survey ship called the HMS Beagle. Although his father was against the trip, Darwin's uncle persuaded Darwin's father to let him go on the 5-year excursion to South America. During the voyage, Darwin kept to his theistic values, so much so that his shipmates teased him as he regularly quoted the Bible. During his long journey, Darwin took notes on everything he saw. Later, these notes were published as a book, now titled Voyage of the Beagle, 1839. In addition to taking notes on his journey, Darwin collected all types of organisms. He took particular interest in fossil creatures he found in South America. He noticed the fossils looked so much like current residents of that area and started to ask questions. Where had the new species come from? Why were some species similar to one another while others were very different? Why was the Earth covered with so many different living things? Darwin did not find the answers during his excursion. In fact, it took him 20 years before he could solve this puzzle. To truly understand the concept of evolution, it helps to know what influenced Darwin's thought during the time of his voyage. The Principles of Geology, published in 1830, was written by his good friend Charles Lyell. This book gave Darwin a new perspective on nature during his trip. In his published works, Lyell revealed how slow, gradual changes over large spans of time could lead to larger, outwardly drastic changes. For example, with sufficient time, seemingly modest sand erosion could cause an entire beach to erode and eventually disappear. This seems elementary today, but back then, the accepted mindset was that the Earth was unchanging. Darwin began to apply the idea of change to organisms, thinking that perhaps new species could form by natural and gradual processes. He began to talk to animal breeders who had been selectively breeding for generations. Through this, he learned how breeders created new lines of animals, realizing that organisms were infinitely variable rather than static and unchanging. As Darwin was beginning to realize the potential for change, he also read another book titled Essay on the Principle of Population by Thomas Malthus. Malthus's book focused on human population growth, indicating that if a population kept growing indefinitely, there would be hunger and famine. Eventually, this would cause a struggle for existence in those who remained. Malthus speculated that organisms with favorable variations would survive and reproduce, while those with unfavorable traits would be destroyed. Then Darwin combined Malthus's idea with his own view that organisms can change over time. One of the most famous examples that struck Darwin on his voyage involved a finch population on the Galapagos Islands. He noticed that the finches on the islands had a range of beak sizes and thicknesses. The finches with thicker beaks could turn over rocks and hunt for seeds when food was scarce. After a particularly brutal drought, only those finches with the thicker beaks survived, while the others were unable to find food and perished. The next year, the average beak thickness on the island increased. Darwin concluded that only the thicker-beaked birds lived through the drought to produce offspring for the next generation. After Darwin returned from his voyage, he studied his specimens and wrote extensively about his travels. As he began to formulate the idea of evolution and natural selection, he talked extensively with his friends, family, and colleagues. He mulled over his ideas, checking and rechecking his facts, while continuing to publish books on his travels and work as a naturalist. Darwin realized that his theory needed to be tested in an experimental setting, so he conducted breeding experiments in both plants and animals. He also read widely for many years to refine and substantiate his idea of evolution. Darwin was in the middle of writing on his findings when he received a letter by fellow naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, asking Darwin to read an unpublished manuscript titled On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. Wallace's conclusion was strikingly similar to Darwin's. Rather than lose credit for the idea of evolution, Darwin's friend and confidant Charles Lyell suggested that the men co-present their views to the scientific world at a meeting. The idea of evolution and natural selection was presented to the Linnean Society jointly in 1858, though both authors were absent from the meeting. Darwin was later encouraged to write an abstract to sum up his findings, which developed into the most famous book, On the Origin of Species. Today, our country continues to debate the existence and teaching of evolution. However, as with any argument, many facts have been lost in the interpretation. Some people interpret Darwin's title to mean origin of the species, meaning humans. Others interpret the title to mean the origin of life. As people have tried to gather evidence for this argument, they have even begun to speculate on Darwin's religious views, assuming there will be a link between his writings on science and his religion. In Darwin's own words, he was a theist when he wrote the On the Origin of Species. He felt that religion and science were not in conflict, since religion was strictly a personal matter and science was to be kept separate from it entirely. Unfortunately, later in life, Darwin lost his daughter, and his faith was shaken. Even in those dark times, he never became an atheist, only agnostic. Darwin died in 1882 and was buried at Westminster Abbey, close to Isaac Newton's grave. He had a Christian funeral, and the area where he is buried was where the King James Bible was translated to English.